Continuing with what we started in the previous video, the current code is available under this URL, and our component currently renders a stateless button. We now need to make the button increment a counter every time it's clicked. We need a state object. To use a state object, React has a special function named useState. This is also globally available here in the playground. So we're going to be invoking this function. This useState function is going to return two items for us. The first item is a state object, and the second item is a function to change that state object. The state object can be of any type you wish it to be. It can be a string, a number, or an array, or anything else. For this use case, we need it to be a number. I'm going to name this state object counter, and name its updater function setCounter. The syntax you need here might look a bit weird, but since JavaScript functions can only return a single value, the useState function returns an array with exactly the two elements here. To make this work, we need a variable defining keyword before this syntax. I'm going to use const. This special syntax here is using JavaScript destructuring feature to capture these two variables in one line. It's not magic or anything. useState returns an array with two elements, and in here we're destructuring these two elements into variables in our button component. The argument to useState is the initial value for the state element counter in our case. Since we want that counter to be a number, we'll set that to 0. To use the two new variables that we introduced, let me tell you a nice little thing about JSX. It supports displaying dynamic expressions if you place them within curly braces anywhere inside JSX. So if I make the button's label into curly braces, and inside these curly braces put any JavaScript expression I want, I'll use math.random and execute the code, the button will have random value every time I render this component. So to use this new state element, all we have to do is put the counter variable within curly braces and make that the label of the button element. The button will now be rendered with a label of 0. This is the same 0 that's coming from the initial value we specified for useState. So any value you initialize here will show up as the button's label, but we'll keep it as 0. Now to use the setCounter updater function, every time we click on this button, we need to introduce an event handler. This is going to look similar to the way we can do this with the DOM API. We define an onClick attribute on the button element. This onClick attribute is also case sensitive. It has to be camel case like this. And unlike the DOM version of the onClick, which receives a string, this React's onClick attribute receives a function reference. So you always specify that inside curly braces as well. In here, we're going to specify a function reference. Let me create a dummy function here. Function, I'm going to name it log random. And we'll make this function console log math.random. Very simple. To use this function as the onClick event handler, we pass in here the function's reference, its name, just like this. To see the console log messages, we need to bring up the browser's console here. And after executing this code, every time I now click on that button, the console will print a random value. Note that when we passed in the log random function here, we did not invoke the function. This will not work. You just need to pass in the pointer to the function. You can also inline the function definition right here inside the curly braces. So basically, you paste in the function definition, and this will work as well. We can make this more concise by using the new arrow function syntax, which can fit in a single line here. Parentheses, arrow, and then the body of the function directly after that. This highlighted part is an inline arrow function definition. We're not invoking the function here. We're defining it and passing this new reference to the onClick prop. This will work as well. So now that we saw how to wire an onClick event, what we need to do to make the counter count is to use the setCounterUpdater function that we got from useState. So instead of console logging a random value here, I'm going to use setCounter, invoke that function, and the argument to setCounter will become the new value of counter here. So if we pass in counter plus 1 as the argument, just like this, and execute this code, then every time the onClick event is triggered now, the counter will be incremented, and you'll see the button behaving as we wanted it to. This useState function is called a hook in the React world. It is similar to a mixin or a module, but it is a stateful one that hooks this simple component into a state. What I need you to notice here is that to reflect the new value of the counter variable in the browser here, we did nothing. We just managed the state of the counter value. React is automatically updating the browser for us thanks to its reactive nature. We did not implement any transactions on this UI. We implemented the transactions on a JavaScript counter object in memory. Our UI implementation was basically telling React that we want the label of the button to always reflect the value of that counter object. We didn't do any DOM updates. React did. You're going to need a few more examples to appreciate this power. So let's add some more features to this basic example. Let's make our UI show many buttons and make all the buttons increment a single counter. But before we do that, let me give you a quick challenge. Instead of a simple counter, change this component to start the button with a label of 5, then double that value on each click. Go ahead and try to make this simple change, and you can see my solution under this URL.